I say your host. I always feel really weird saying that. It just seems really, I don't know, it just sounds really odd. Anyway, I'm Tim. I'm here. I'm talking about swords. So yeah, tonight we're going to be looking at how to fight dirty with saber, scabbard, and kicks, based on the manual of Augustin Chambon from 1911. So just early 20th century, lead up a few years before World War One, which I think is like unofficially the cutoff for HEMA. The point where it sort of HEMA kind of stops at is World War One, for whatever reason. I guess you got the combatant, like the Fairburn people who like to do some World War II stuff. So that's not a very exact measure. But anyway, point is, this is a manual about using swords in essentially 20th century, early 20th century, or like prior to World War One era sort of context. So still very much military doctrines revolve around formation, like large formations, and use of cavalry, and then because it's only a few years before that'd be kind of rendered irrelevant by trenches, machine guns, and barbed wire. But yeah, so Chambon talks about how to deal with a mounted opponent. He talks about how to deal with both a lancer and a mounted opponent with a saber. Interesting enough, the techniques he describes are basically the same for both. The tactical advice is different, although there's some things where it's not clear, at least not clear to me, why he talks about it only in the context of dealing with a mounted opponent with either a saber or a lance, one of the two. Because it's not really apparent why he only talks about it in one section, why he doesn't just say just do this against every mounted opponent. But then again, there's he also repeats himself a lot in each of the sections. The way his manual is divided up is divided by weapon you will be facing. So he has one section for your opponent has a saber, whether they're mounted or on foot. And then he has another section for a mounted opponent with lance, even though the way he deals with mounted opponent is incredibly similar for both saber and lance. So just to be clear about where I'm coming from with this, so I think I mentioned in the previous video, my background is primarily in 19th century British saber, also things like foil and really the stuff that was going on in the English-speaking world at the time. I'm much newer to French systems, Chambon being French. So I've read through and experimented a bit with French saber manuals, but nowhere near as much. So there's bits of that I might get wrong. But more relevant, I think, to this is I've never actually fenced against someone on horseback, either me being on foot and then being mounted, or me being mounted against someone who was also mounted, or even me being mounted against someone on foot. I've basically never combined horses and swords, much as I would love to. Have a little bit of experience with riding as a kid. So actually, weird fact about me is I lived on a farm until about age 10, and used to ride horses. In fact, one of the things that I did before moving to Sydney at age 10 was go to riding camp. So I'd started to really enjoy horse riding, and then obviously couldn't do it anymore. But yeah, so I have a very general knowledge of horse riding, and have really no hands-on experience with doing it. So this is mostly supposition on my part, and mostly me using the knowledge that I have theoretically gained from sword fighting, doing martial arts on foot, and then applied to and then I sort of applied the same kind of ideas about how movement works to visualizing how this sort of stuff works. Although most of the stuff seems pretty self-explanatory, so that's good. Obviously, within that, if you do disagree with something I say, just jam it down in the comments. If you have a question, put that in the comments. Really, just if you want to say a thing, put that down in the comments. The only reason these are me broadcasting rather than being more like being a sort of a discussion type thing done via Zoom is because broadcasting them via Restream is a lot easier for me. So yeah, pure laziness. But anyway, point is, if you have a comment, just leave it. Or like just put it, like just type it in. I will do my best to get to it. I won't necessarily get to it straight away, but I will get to it at some point in the evening. Yeah. So, for all intents and purposes, I'm grabbing my trusty saber and my stick is representing a scabbard. I actually really tempted to try this with two swords because looking at the motions, I was also looking at people doing videos of people doing case of swords. I'm like, this seems like it would work, or this seems kind of similar to sword and scabbard. And the scabbard would be a second saber would probably be a lot easier to handle than a scabbard and a bit more useful, but the stuff would definitely work. So assuming that you weren't, or just to refresh what we talked about in the previous ones, Chambon's basic guard. I stand with my feet 2 foot apart. I bend my knees to a nice kind of comfortable bend, so that I'm not constantly sort of moving back and forth, making big obvious movements. I can make small, very subtle movements, which is going to be very, very relevant to tonight. My saber is held in a very, it's like a, as opposed to it's like a sort of standard tier scale like this, except contracted. You basically go tier scale and then just squish my elbow back to keep everything coiled. That. And the scabbard is held basically with your hand, with your scabbard hand sitting on your scabbard side hip, but drifting across the body so that if you sit on the side, I'm keeping it mostly out of the way. In fact, a big part of this seems to be that the guards are modified versions of normal sort of saber and foil guard type things. They're specifically modified to get, so that things you don't tangle yourself up. If I was down here like this, there's a big risk that doing stuff would collide. Whereas if I'm like this, I've got a lot of free space in front of me to maneuver. So, what does Chambon say to do against cavalry? Well, the first thing he says is get to the left side. So with both the lance and the sabre, he says it's well known that cavalry are at extreme disadvantage if you can get to. He specifically says the left side. I assume that he doesn't think that there'll be any left-handed cavalry out there. So I'd actually be very curious if that's a thing that modern practitioners have faced. Like if you get someone who's left-handed. How do you actually deal with that? But yeah, so he's basically he says get to the left side because when you have a horse's head in your way, I can just get my chair is kind of to get you a sense of horse. This is not going to be very accurate because horses are not square, but it gives you a sense if I am basically here on my couch with my horse's head in the way. Yeah, sort of like here-ish. If I'm this side, I have to change sides, and if I have to reach across the horse, I actually have to lean quite a bit to get there, which makes moving harder for me. So if you're against an opponent, getting to the left side gives you a huge advantage. What Chambon says is if your opponent's armed with a saber, if you get to the left side, just go on the offensive because they're going to be struggling, and by the time, you're going to have the initiative and you can just go. And Chambon reckons that the main thing that you have to worry about with a mounted opponent is actually psychological, that the horse, the big, big muscular kind of creature is really quite scary. So you have to, the big thing you have to worry about is holding your nerve. He says that also it's very, very easy to get very fixated on your opponent's lance, which can be quite dangerous because they're quick and deceptive. But the saber by contrast is capable of much more varied play. So still something to worry about. What he also says is, he says if you're facing a group of cavalry, what you should do is just start basically running to their left. So if they're coming at you like in a line or something like that, run to left of them, and then use the fact that they're all at a consecutive disadvantage and the horse can't maneuver very quickly, to basically keep yourself safe. He says it's utterly impossible to ever outrun them. The other thing he says is if you can use terrain to your advantage, you should. So if you can run into like a building or near a forest or whatever, he's not specific about what he means by what type of terrain he's talking about, or if he's talking about terrain. So I assume he's talking about terrain just in the general sense. That's really useful. The other thing he says this in the Sabre section, and I do wonder if it's not as useful against the Lancer, but what he says is that if you're going to go to your opponent, to your opponent's left, you should actually feint that you're going to go right. So, like step kind of right, and then bolt left, as a way of basically getting your opponent to think that you're going to go to one side and then go to the other, so they don't have time to redirect their horse. The way we do that, based on how 19th century footwork generally works, is you traverse slightly. So I've widened my legs. I made a much bigger movement with my body. You can see that my body weight is above my left leg. And because this leg is now, I've got a lot of weight in this leg, is now essentially coiled like a spring, I can then use to fire sideways and move sideways quite quickly. I actually quite like this movement as a feint, even just in sword and sword. You can move one side with an attack, and then fight and move the other very, very quickly. And particularly if you're very athletic, it's very, very bouncy. It can be quite deceptive and quite difficult for your opponent to deal with. That's Chambon's main advice, is get to the left side. But the techniques he advises for both an mounted opponent with a sabre and a mounted opponent with a lance are nearly almost entirely the same, with one small area of exception. So I thought I'd go through the things he says to do. And he says he basically has three techniques for the majority of situations. He says that as far as he's concerned, a sabre is most likely going to thrust. And he says that, he says outright that sabres are primarily thrusting weapons, which I think by his day and age was true. You look at the sorts of sabres that were being used at least in Britain and also France, and also actually America, they were primarily thrusting weapons. They theoretically could cut, but you had to put a lot of power into it because they were not designed with cutting in mind. Just something Chambon actually comments on. So, if I'm on my guard, if my opponent attacks my chest, so starting here, basically, what I meant, like anywhere really below the line of the shoulders, I'd be surprised if they go for legs because it's a very, very long way down, even against me, big team person. What you do is you strike up and you parry by raising up your scabbard into a high tierce position. And as this sits from the side, I've raised really, really high, much higher than I ever would if I was facing an opponent on foot. Because on foot, this wouldn't really cover anything, but against a mounted opponent, knocking them like in a very, very long distance is quite helpful. So like just basically driving them so that the weapon is all out there is really helpful for me, because it means that they've got much less chance of parrying. And then basically, as soon as my scabbard has reached, a normal kind of high tierce parry position, I start dropping my sword and thrusting. And what he says is basically stick your sword out because your opponent will run into it. So I'm raising and stabbing. And he assumes basically that the horse is not going to be coming directly at you. It's going to be coming at you to one side. So you don't need to move. You don't need to worry about the horse colliding with you. And what Chambon says is you thrust either at the belly of your mounted opponent or at the side of the horse. And he says that thrust is not going to encounter much resistance because of the weight of the horse is basically going to, the weight and the speed of the horse is just going to drive it straight onto your point. So I'll show you that again. Up, thrust. Up and thrust. Up and thrust. And just once more. I know I said last time that I was assuming that no one's following. Well, you're not going to follow along, but a figure showing you from multiple angles is still good. And up and thrust. And obviously, if you're drilling this, then your goal is to be one is to get as smooth as possible, certainly smoother than I am, to the point where you're basically getting bring your sword online as quickly as possible. And this is something you see with a lot of 19th century or late, actually really more early 20th century cavalry manuals. General George Patton, the famous US World War II general, actually wrote one of the last cavalry manuals in the Western world. And what he says is basically with any kind of cavalry engagement, trying to kind of sort of whether it's two mounted soldiers fighting each other, or alternatively, someone on foot fighting, fending off cavalry. He says basically you only really get time to do one thing, and so a big thing so he actually advocated counter thrusts as well. Or his idea was more he didn't use a scabbard, he just dived behind sword, which I find kind of interesting parallel. But yeah, same idea here where I don't really have time to parry and then riposte. It's better to assume I don't. I need to parry with the scabbard and bring my sword out as quickly as I can. But I also need to practice doing that as smoothly as I can, because I don't the last thing I want is to clash and basically embarrass myself against the fancy mounted opponent. The next thing that Chambon says to do is basically if your opponent thrusts at your head or at your shoulders, so basically above the line of the armpits, what you need to do is defend yourself with the sword. So he says basically come in and knock the thrust down, and then if you can direct your thrust in, or even just bring your tip straight on line to hit the horse. A sense I get is that basically he thinks that this movement is too slow if you're defending something from like your nose. You're not going to get there in time, and because this isn't like a normal kind of parry where I can really parry at any point in my opponent's attack, and so long as they stay on that line of attack, they will not dissect me. This is not about creating a line for your opponent's weapon to travel down to create an opening. This is about knocking and attacking flat. So these parries are much more like beats than they are like a conventional. I'm just going to parry and then riposte at my leisure. Kind of parries, well, not riposte at leisure, but I have to time it in order to be successful. So yeah, same deal here is I'm basically coming from my contracted, weird, squished tierce position all the way up either into a low tierce or even a second position. So to get a sense of the difference, second, my hand is at this angle here, and in line with the sword side of my body, whereas in low tierce, my hand is same height and extension or even lower, but is in the tierce angle, this angle. Chambon basically says you can use them interchangeably, and for his purposes, they're basically the same thing. So really, if you're doing this, just do whichever you prefer. Just do what you want. I'm not going to stop you. Right. So yeah, same with your is down. And then just flick your tip up to try it as best you can. Down to parry and to really displace and flip the tip up, down, and when you can, just flip the tip up. And this is just a quick movement. All I'm really doing is bring my tip online. If you think of this in terms of like fencing on foot, normally I bring my tip online and then lunge, but with this, the horse is doing the lunge for me. The other thing to remember about this is the angles are a bit different because nothing is coming at you straight. So, if you've got a spear, just put my spear on the doorpost here, you can see how this is coming at me at an angle. So if I intercept it, even pushing forward like this drives it down. And yeah, sure, it's still pointing at me, but the more forward it comes, the more forward I come, the more down it goes. So I'm basically creating an angle where I'm redirecting it down. And one of the things actually, and this can work quite well with all kinds of fencing, if you can create this angle where, if I can get an angle here where my opponent feels like their weapon is relatively close to my chest, but I've created an angle to control it, they can push themselves forward and drive themselves down. That's actually something that I've done a bit in foil fencing, is basically set it up so that my opponent's tip is online but intersected so that it is driven further and further offline the closer they come. And it works really, really well because it's really, really deceptive. So Mick's just asked a good question I want to answer. So Mick said, so nice question, a bit late to the party. Stylishly late, I guess, in this case. But is this a complete system using the scabbard and Sabre or an emergency system? If for an emergency, how do they remove the scabbard from the baldric? Short answer is he doesn't discuss how you get from running around with your Sabre in its scabbard, let alone how do you get the scabbard off your belt or your baldric or your webbing or whatever it's attached to. I probably should check what the French uniform was. I know they had the standard French infantry at the time had big bandoliers. I think officers would have been using a belt. But yeah, Chambon doesn't discuss that at all. He doesn't say how to get to the this position. He just says basically he starts when you're in guard. In terms of whether it's a complete system or an emergency system, it's a system of fencing. It's weird in that it's written from the perspective of essentially you are standing against an opponent, engagement happens, off you go, but with some additional tactical advice. And I kind of get the impression that even though Chambon is drawing from actual military experience to describe some of the things you mentioned, how to deal with multiple bayonets or how to take advantage of terrain and things like that, there's a lot of this which is stuff that he's innovated and worked out in the fencing cell. So there is an element of it where you are starting engagement. He assumes that you will be on guard when you'll be improperly on guard when your opponent or when you hit engagement, which is an assumption, I guess. There's no sense from him that you might have been moving and all of a sudden there's an opponent there. It's you are on guard and that's when his instruction actually starts. So yeah, no indication how you're going to get the sword out. In terms of if it were me and I was planning on using both my Sabre and my scabbard, I probably would end up just carrying my scabbard, or carrying my Sabre and scabbard in a hand. Much like officers used to have a swagger stick or something like that, and then just bust it out. Like the world's most inconvenient umbrella. Or possibly what Chambon expects is that as soon as you get to the battlefield, you'll just detach the sword from scabbard and start carrying it instead of drawing the sword. I don't know. He doesn't say. That's guesswork on my part, but I don't know. It seems logical to me. Then again, I've never been on a late 19th or early 20th century battlefield while people are shooting at me. So, yeah, don't know. All right. So the other thing Chambon says to do is he says you can parry up. So if my opponent comes in just thrusting at the face, I can parry upwards, which to me always seems kind of odd. Like unless it's kind of an extension thing as well. Like unless I'm relying kind of on this percussive extension to knock my opponent's sword weapon up in the same way that I knocked it down with the previous technique, or like going in the opposite direction, but same principle. But yeah, you basically, it might also be that he expects you to straighten your arm and then fire up, like kind of do a sort of a scoop kind of thing, like that. Either way, he says you can do it against a face thrust, and he says you can also do it against a torso thrust by squatting down. So what I do is drop and thrust up, which kind of makes it an interestingly universal defense. And then from there, once I've basically knocked high, I just extend and let my opponent run onto my sword. I find it interesting that he doesn't modify the riposte for Sabre. He seems to think the same thing will work in both instances, whereas I imagine the Sabre would be a lot closer. But it's probably still room. But yeah, so the technique of defending high is extend and punch, and come to guard. Extend, punch, and riposte. Extend, punch, and riposte. There are times when he seems to be doing it with a straight arm, and there are times when he seems to be doing it as just a normal high tierce. And yeah, I get confused as well, so I totally feel that. Yeah. And then, of course, you can also do the same thing with a squat. You don't have to scoot quite as much. You can just fire up when you do it with the squat as well, which is kind of nice. Bang! Straight down. Bang! Straight down. The Chambon's probably a bit of a squatting than I am. But yeah, that's his kind of, most of his advice is basically if they thrust at you, if they thrust at your head, either sort of knock it down or knock it straight up. If they thrust at your torso, knock it to side with your scabbard and counter thrust, or just squat and knock up, because why not? He does have specific advice, or some specific advice for lance and sabre opponents in terms of technique. Like I said, most of the difference for him is tactical, although there's so much of tactics he describes that would, to my mind at least, would work equally well for each. So I also do suspect that part of the divisions that is more an issue of format, where he divided things up by weapon, and then when he started writing, he was like, oh yeah, so you just do the same thing as you did the previous time. But one of the things he says that's different is with the lance, is he says you can use crochet or envelopment, which is where you parry and then move to another position. So I might choose a foot sword example. I might parry and cart and then sweep through to prime as a way of changing where my opponent is, or my opponent's sword is before I riposte. A crochet is where you change, usually specifically height, but you basically you move them in a half circle, and an envelopment is where you take a full circle. But what he says is basically you can do this as your riposte, especially given the height. So if my opponent is coming in, and particularly if they're coming in, actually, I really should work both sides, like most both. If I come in and I punch out with my sword, I can then crochet to, or disengage really, to an extended position, thereby basically disordering my opponent's weapon. Works mostly for lance, especially because the weapon is so long, you've got so much leverage with your shorter punching a sword. There's also got like a nice grippy bit up here. You can use the intersection of the guard and blade to kind of hold things in place. I can hit out and then disengage to a counter thrust. Can hit out and disengage to a counter thrust. Can hit out and disengage to a counter thrust. Or riposte thrust, or counter thrust. Well, I guess it is riposting with a counter thrust technically. But yeah, that's the other thing he says you can do against lance. I imagine that it would work. It wouldn't work quite as well against someone with a sabre because they're starting a lot closer, and because they're a lot closer, but still moving, you don't have quite as much time. So I think, which is why he favours more direct movements against the sabre. Against the sabre, he says you are going to have to deal with cuts. He says you can't. He says they can't. Sometimes you do get swiped out with the lance. In which case you just parry it. You just parry it the way you normally would parry a sabre. But he also says with the lance, it's not a huge worry. Like you're mostly only going to get a bruise anyways. You're wearing like however much, sort of big woolen jacket and all those, and various kind of webbing and sort of gear and stuff. So yeah, no, like he's not too concerned with like lance slashes, but he thinks that sabre slashes are significant, because he doesn't think that they're as debilitating as thrusts. But for that, you just use your standard parries and fire out into a tierce from this retracted position. And just start bang. Standard kind of tierce if it's the attack is coming in. He doesn't actually mention card as a parry. I suspect because he assumes that if your opponent is on your left, and so it would need to be parrying to the cart parry, so this kind of parry. You'd have to be to the left of the cart, the mounted opponent, so you can already. You should already be on the offensive, or it shouldn't really be a situation you find yourself in. And so the reason why you punch out, I think I've covered this in the previous video, is this position in of itself is actually biomechanically weak. Like you wouldn't parry something like this because the force of the blow can come in and press against your shell, which basically means that your elbow is basically a hinge here. Or you can move straight down the lever and collide into you. So if you think of like a door, if you think of a door, right. Oh, fix that door there. Sorry. If you think of a door, if you're opening a door, if you move it back and forth in line with the rotation of the hinge, it moves fine. If you push directly against it, it's not going to go anywhere. But the other thing is, if you push slightly to the side of it, you can see that. So instead of pushing straight downwards, if I push slightly to the side, I can still, you're still going to push against a hinge. You're still going to get against that joint and rotate it. And the same thing happens with the joints in your body, where if force can be pushed against a joint, they will move, which is good because it actually, that's kind of the thing that really stops us from hurting our joints a lot, is that the joint will just move. It will just reconfigure. But the problem is when you're trying to parry a blow and your joint collapses, then you get hit. So humans are not perfectly evolved to sword fight. Sword fighting was clearly not a big evolutionary pressure on humans. That's a good statement. But yeah, so he does say that you basically just punch out, or even you might even have to come to like a second or a tier scale like we saw before to parry. He just says it's a thing that can happen. He says you use parry riposte, doesn't really go into much detail per se, but it's fairly intuitive if you've done the Sabre sort of stuff. Is you parry riposte, parry riposte, parry riposte. Like just come straight back. But yeah, he kind of assumes. I think he assumes a degree of training and practice in just saber fencing, but certainly in terms of what he's teaching. I mean, he does talk about that sort of stuff a bit more in his how to deal with someone, say with saber on foot section that we'll talk about next week. But otherwise, yeah, he just says just do it. His advice is for the cavalry is mostly tactical. What I do find interesting is he thinks that the person on foot actually has the advantage in that he thinks that they will, particularly if you are alone on foot, you will have in a 1-on-1 combat with a mounted opponent, you'll have an advantage. I find that interesting. Especially against cavalry who are moving, I imagine that it would be, quite dire and quite desperate. But then again, I have never actually fought someone on horseback, so yeah, nice. Cool. So we got through that a little bit quicker than I expected. Does anyone have any questions either about what we've looked about tonight, or anything else in Chambon's manual, or just in general? If you have any questions, just chuck them down the chat, because we've still got a little while, and there's not. A lot of his stuff is quite quick and dirty in terms of dealing with this. What I find really interesting about it is it's very, very situational. I guess going back to Mick's question about whether it's a complete system or an emergency system, Chambon seemingly assumes that you know how to fence, or at the very he makes references to things. He writes out, he's got a complete system in the sense of he has a complete guide to techniques, but there's a whole bunch that he doesn't really say how to do or what to do. He just says, you do this thing in this situation. He does seem to assume that you know a degree of saber fencing, which I always find really interesting from a kind of a audience perspective. So when I think about a manual, I think there are 3 ways you can analyze a manual. Same, but there are different ways you can analyze a literary text. There are 3 kind of analytical lenses you can look at manuals through. First is looking at the manual in its purely in its own terms. So the only thing you look at is what is in the manual, and only only reference it against what is also in the manual. You don't take into account any other sort of external factors, which is honestly what the majority of humorists seem to do. And that kind of gives you a really interesting sense of how the stuff works in its own terms. You can also look at the manual in terms of authorial intent. So you look at Chambon, basically what he expected someone to know. So when he talks about already know, he says things that you would have to already know how to use a saber to understand, you ask yourself, well, how would what has he trained? Where did he train? You look at his life story. You also look at statements he makes about what he's trying to achieve and see what else that aligns in within fencing texts. And then you look at it from an audience perspective, where you go, okay, well, who was reading this and what sorts of things were floating around that they could have known about, which I always find is the most interesting kind of analytical lens, but it's also the most flexible because, when I look at Jules Jacob's work, Jules Jacob had potentially quite a broad audience because he was read well outside of France. There's times where he talks about saber dueling, where if you look at it from the perspective of Jules Jacob and what kinds of things he would have been exposed to, there's some very specific French manuals that describe describe the sorts of techniques would have been drawing from. But Hutton obviously read Jules Jacob, and Hutton in Cold Steel. Hutton actually said that people who enjoyed his basically said that people should read Jules Jacob as well, especially for the épée section. And so you have to go, well, there were obviously a section of the audience for this manual who were practicing British fencing, which is different, like British sabre, which is different to French sabre, particularly in this period, and also different to Italian sabre. And really, it was very much its own thing, much like, which is true of most sabre methods in the period, but that debate from the late 90s hasn't entirely died as of yet. There's sort of this weird idea that Hutton is kind of just basically misunderstood Italian fencing, which is not the case. Hutton is very, very clear that he is drawing primarily off British work, like other British works, and like a domestic tradition of sabre fencing, with a few influences from the Italians, but they are very much a tertiary influence on what he's doing. But yeah, you have to imagine, well, what if the person reading this, who picked up, Jules Jacob's manual, was someone who picked it up off Hutton's recommendation and is familiar with Hutton's sabre fencing rather than the sort of things that Jules Jacob intended? What would have they done with it? So, I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about things and look at them. So I've got another question from Mick. Mick says, are there any strikes in the scabbard, or is it only used for parrying? That's a more interesting. The answer to that is longer than just yes or no, because there sort of are. Basically, Chambon does say has movements that are essentially strikes with the scabbard, but he uses them as beats. And this is purely against sabre. Basically, he doesn't think you're ever going to strike with the sabre against a mounted opponent or against someone with a bayonet, which to me makes a lot of sense. Like, against the bayonet, against the bayonet, I'm either going to be so far away that all I can do is parry, or so close that I'm looking to kick or pummel strike or punch the guts and things like that. I do find it weird that he says you punch them with the scabbard hand rather than smacking them with the bottom edge of the scabbard, which I feel like would hurt them a lot more, because the scabbard is, this period solid steel. So no strikes there. Obviously, no strikes against cavalry, because just you're never close enough, and you're never really close enough, or there's very rarely a point where your scabbard is in a position to strike. But against an opponent with just a sabre, what he says to do is basically punch out. I'll look at this in more detail next week, but you basically punch out and you strike and you hit the sabre to knock it away, to give yourself an opening to come in with the sword. And I mean, quite honestly, this movement, the way you do this movement, or you optimize this movement for delivering a beat, is pretty similar to the way you optimize this movement for delivering damage, or like to actually smack the person. So there is a technique there that can be very easily used as a scabbard strike, and I imagine that in the context of bouting with this, I've only done a very small amount of bouting with this specific system at this point in time. Do certainly intend to do more, but yeah, you definitely could use that as a strike. So short answer to the question is there are striking movements, but they're used. Chambon uses them as beats, not as direct attacks. He prefers the sword for direct attack, or he also prefers thrust to cut, which I tend to instinctively do a lot of cuts, because Hutton's system and late 19th century British systems are very, very cut centric. I think actually their infantry drills were still very cut centric, even when they went to a very thrusty sword. So yeah. But yeah, no, it's interesting. The other thing I find very interesting about this is how it kind of aligns with a lot of the mentality of a lot of French manuals in the period, where there's a lot of them that are very situation specific. So things like the Defense d'Armes Leroux manuals, where it's like, okay, you're approached by, in this situation, here's what you do. And it becomes like a lot of the French sort of martial tradition or martial arts traditions in this period become very, very almost scenario focused. Like obviously you do have that sort of standard, we're in the cell, we square up, we go kind of everything, fencing, stick fighting, savate, kickboxing type thing. Like there's still plenty of that, but you do see a drastic increase in scenario-specific stuff, which is not that common in European martial arts prior, and from what I gather, not particularly common even in in European martial arts as a whole prior to this. I mean, I can give a little bit in Fiore, and there's a few other times where you get situation-specific stuff, but yeah, it's not. I mean, the closest you really get to that in most cases is what is cross-weapon bounding, so what to do if someone is armed with something different. And even then, most manuals primarily deal with here's how to fight against someone who has the same weapon as you on neutral ground and all other things being equal. And they'll talk a bit about like things like left-handed, like physical differences like left-handedness, or against a stronger opponent, against a taller opponent, against a shorter opponent, kind of thing. But not stuff like you're in this, you're dealing with this kind of situation, or if there's terrain around, like go and hide in the bushes, sort of thing. That's something fairly uniquely that seems to really happen in France after the Franco-Prussian War, when they're sort of going through this period of national renewal and trying to reinvigorate their national strength and military virility, which is a thing, or is just that's kind of, I don't know, seems like an interesting kind of product of that, because the French, quite famously after the Franco-Prussian War, repeatedly learnt the wrong lessons. Like they changed around a lot of the weapons they were using, even though the weapons they were using were quite good, for the period, but kept their command structures intact, which apparently that was a big problem for the French, was just that their command systems were just a mess, which is part of why they lost the Franco-Prussian War. So it's kind of interesting that they became incredibly pragmatic about hand-to-hand combat, whether in a civilian or military setting. But very, very, otherwise very romanticized, very, very romanticized, and almost kind of focused on like spiritual renewal, which is a thing that happens after you lose a war. The most horrific example of that is after World War I in Germany. You get the rise of fascism as this kind of palingenetic ultranationalism, where they want to renew the strength of the nation through purification, and purification in this case meaning genocide, and also war, which also involves a lot of genocide. But you see the same. You see kind of a not as genocidal version of the same thing in a lot of countries. Like you look back at a lot of like 80s action movies in the US, and it's like the rise of bodybuilder physiques and kind of this incredible national sort of posturing macho kind of stuff, and a lot of that was about national renewal. I mean, you see it in this Ronald Reagan's kind of his famous catchphrase, "It's morning in America." The sun, it's got all this imagery of the sun has risen on a new day in America. Like we're changing. It's a new day. We're starting again. We've gotten through the bad period of the instability of the 60s and 70s, and now we can renew ourselves as a nation by ultimately making a lot of decisions that led to the economic situation we're in now. But I got really off topic. I was hoping someone would ask another question that time. I was like, all right, what do I talk about? I don't know. Let's just let's complain about neoliberalism, because somehow I'm doing that enough in my day-to-day life. But if there's anyone other questions, if not, we will be back next week to look at how to deal with someone with a saber. Unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to be able to meet up in person before the end of the year to test some of this stuff out in bouting, and I'm still working on how I'm going to make a something that I can use as a scabbard substitute I was thinking of using just a second sword, like just having just basically doing this as dual wielding. But I think that's not going to produce a sufficiently similar result, if that makes sense. Like I'm not going to, using another saber instead of a scabbard would be different to just using a scabbard, especially because the weight distribution is different, but also, the saber has a lot more hand protection, which, does seem to be a factor in this. Like the reason why the hand is held so withdrawn is so that the saber or the saber hand, or the hand holding the scabbard can't get hit. So to give you a sense of it, I want to keep my scabbard back here at my hip. Again, so there's a lot of juicy tin targets before someone can have a go at my hand here. Whereas if I held it out the way I would a saber, there's a risk of me getting whacked in the hand, which it's not great. I don't think it's a particularly great risk. Like there are stick fencing systems that fence from here, but there does seem to be a very conscious effort made to keep the hand back as a way of keeping, and that is partially, I suspect, as a way of keeping it safe. I don't want to really fire it out, which might also be the other reason why you don't see direct attacks. To go back to Nick's previous question, again, the reason you don't see Chambon advocate direct attacks to the body, particularly as an opening, is that if I fire out, my opponent can slip and counter my hand if my hand position isn't good. Whereas if I strike with my opponent's sword, my hand is only really in distance for attack for the brief of those microseconds, and that's in a point where my opponent's sword is already being occupied by being smacked by the scabbard. And there's never a point, and I think Chambon is also the attitude that because the saber is capable of dealing much more damage than the scabbard in in a wider variety of situations. Obviously, just smacking someone with a scabbard is going to still do a lot of damage to them. He's of the mind that if you're going to parry with one weapon and strike with the other, you're better off parrying with the scabbard and striking with the sword. Which also goes into my advice for dual wielding. One of the things that may help me get the hang of fencing with two weapons, I do a lot of it, but I do enough that I'm kind of okay at it, was thinking that each weapon has a specific role. So if I go and grab my saber, when I come on guard, each saber has specific jobs. So this saber defends this side of me. This saber defends this side of me. My attacks all come inwards. I'm not at no point am I trying to bring my saber across my body to attack like that. The only time I do that is if I'm, say, clearing. So I might be like, all right, this saber clears my opponent's weapon for this one to come in. But otherwise, there are specific roles they do. It's not like I'm trying to do single saber fencing on both sides, because that gets confusing and will tangle my weapons up. My saber cuts inwards and retracts as a way of staying, cuts inwards and retracts as a way of it not tangling or not getting caught up on the opponent's saber. I can, just do a direct snap cut, but that's about it. I really don't want to be bringing my saber across my body like that. I've got the other saber for that. And having distinct roles for each weapon, each weapon has a distinct job that it does, and if I'm going to attack a certain area, it's always with the same weapon. Makes it a lot easier to handle. And so that's kind of my approach to using two sabers And I think that's also why we're fighting with two weapons, but the two weapons being different is a lot easier and a lot less confusing than fighting with two of the same kind of weapon, is because it's very, very clear what each thing is meant to do. The scabbard's job is to defend. The scabbard's job in this sense is to defend everything except the high saber side line, theoretically low, but it's mostly there to beat and to parry, to set up saber attacks, and the saber is responsible for attacks at the end, direct attacks at the enemy, and with the basically parrying in situations where the scabbard can't. So again, high saber side line, parrying to here. You can see how that's going to cause problems because now my arm is in the way of my saber and getting it around is going to be frustrating. So I guess to answer Nick's question as well, one of the other reasons why you probably don't see that many strikes with the scabbard is because that's not its job, and that isn't to say that you can't, just that in most cases the scabbard, it is better to try and use each weapon to do a consistent role. So yes, cool. So unless anyone has any more questions, or I go off another tirade, which is a danger. We will be meeting up on Zoom after this just to kind of chat. So if you want more tirades, there will be tirades on Zoom, most likely. But also, if you enjoyed this and want to support the Old Sword Club and what we do, consider donating, or don't even go further than considering it. Actually donate is even better. Yes. But yeah, obviously, with the coming of the new year, we're going to go back to physical classes, hopefully. Omicron strain is kind of scary. But yeah, hopefully we'll be able to go back and start teaching in person again, which would be good. If you don't, and yeah, so we are going to need money to cover that, to cover those costs. I'm going to try and continue doing live streams. It'll probably be on every second Sunday or at over weekends rather than during the week, just because when I go, particularly once I'm back at the office or back on campus, physically working, rushing home to do a live stream is going to be a bit more difficult, but I will do it. I'll do my best. And yeah, other than that, we'll try and keep delivering content, and hopefully I'll be able to do more sorty stuff. Anyway, I'm going to jump off. I'll hopefully see you next week when we talk about how to use the scabbard to deal with someone with just a saber, so you can lord it over all of those, just saber using people types. And yeah, we'll see you then.